I'm Lisa Ansell, Associate Director of the USC Casden Institute, and on behalf of the USC Casden Institute and the Tel Aviv University Center for the Study of the United States, I would like to welcome you all to today's event on the topic of From October 7th to November 5th, the impact of the Gaza war on the US presidential elections. Since October 7th, the American Jewish community has encountered loss, both personal and collective. We have experienced threats, intimidation, and anti-Semitism on a scale not seen since the Holocaust. We have embarked upon new ventures to rebuild our lives and strengthen our communities. We have entered a period both of self-reflection and shared learning as we confront our changing and challenging society, and the upcoming presidential election will clearly manifest the various ways in which the Gaza war has influenced Jewish, Muslim, and progressive voters in the US, as well as views Israelis hold of America. To this end, we are honored to host a panel comprised of leading political scientists, demographers, and historians today who will present original scholarship analysis that will serve to contextualize and explain the historic significance of the upcoming elections. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to say a word about the structure of today's event. Our panel will engage in a meaningful discussion for about an hour. Then we will move into a question and answer session where you will have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function, which will be answered by our panelists. I invite you to place your questions in the Q&A function at any point throughout this program. And now it is an honor to introduce our featured speakers today. Our panel today will be moderated by Dr. Bruce Phillips. Bruce is a professor of sociology and Jewish communal studies in the Lockheim School of Judaic Studies at Hebrew Union College and the University of Southern California, and senior research fellow at the USC Center for Religion and Civic Culture. He has been among the leading researchers in the sociology of American Jewry for over 3 decades. His published work covers a wide variety of topics from Iranians and Israelis in the United States to Jewish suburbanization, Jewish education, the economics of Jewish life, and the Jews of Los Angeles. His 2005 essay, American Judaism in the 21st Century, is among the most widely cited sources on contemporary American Jewish denominations. He is widely recognized as a leading researcher on American Jewish intermarriage. His current research projects examine the impact of migration and community size on the affiliation of new migrants, multiracial studies as a lens for understanding Jews of mixed parentage, and applying the work of economists to understanding intermarriage. We welcome Bruce Phillips. Dan Schnur is a professor at the University of Southern California's Annenberg School of Communications and University of California, Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies. He has been teaching courses in politics, communications, and leadership since 1996, and has also taught at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University and George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. He is the director for the California Influencers Project, a statewide program in which 60 of the state's foremost experts in politics, policy, and governmental issues in the 2018 campaign. He is the founder of the USC LA Times statewide political poll. Previously, Dan Schnur worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns as one of California's leading political strategists and served as the National Director of Communications for the 2000 presidential campaign of US Senator John McCain, and was the chief media spokesman for California Governor Pete Wilson. In 2014, he ran for statewide office as a nonpartisan candidate for California Secretary of State. Dan Schnur has been an advisor to multiple foundations, trusts, think tanks, and a variety of K-12 education and college and workforce preparedness efforts. His commentaries have appeared in several newspapers, including the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Sacramento Bee, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and the New York Times. In addition, he has been an analyst and political commentator for CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, National Public Radio, and the Los Angeles Jewish Journal. We welcome Dan Schnur. Laura Silver is an associate director at Pew Research Center. She is an expert in international survey research and writes about a variety of topics, including global attitudes towards China, views of democracy, and opinions about foreign policy. She has been a lead author of many innovative reports, including a data essay comparing US and Chinese soft power, a report based on an open-ended question about what would improve democracy. On the quantitative side, Laura is involved in all aspects of the center's research process, including designing survey questionnaires, sample designs, managing fieldwork, processing and analyzing data, and writing reports. Prior to joining Pew Research Center, Laura was a foreign affairs research analyst at the US Department of State in the Office of Opinion Research, where she designed and implemented surveys in East Asia. In this role, Laura was awarded Best New Analyst by the Bureau of Intelligence and Research for her public opinion analysis. She received a dual PhD from the Annenberg School of Communication and the Political Science Department at the University of Pennsylvania, where her work focused on the American public opinion of China, particularly in the context of presidential elections. We welcome Laura Silver. Amnon Kavari is an associate professor and head of the Institute for Liberty and Responsibility at the Lauder School of Government, Diplomacy, and Strategy at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. Amnon's primary research interests are in the interrelationship between political elites and public opinion in the United States and Israel. In addition, Amnon is head of the research group American Public Opinion Towards Israel, which tracks trends in American elite and mass opinion towards Israel, and is co-chair of the Israeli Policy Agendas Project. He is the author of American Public Opinion Towards Israel, The Party Politics of Presidential Rhetoric, co-editor of 2 books on presidential elections in the United States, and author of several journal articles. He is also a frequent contributor to various media outlets. Amnon is also the recipient of the 2020 Emerging Scholar Award of 2020. We welcome Amnon Kavari. And now it is my great pleasure to invite Bruce Phillips to begin our discussion today.
So our format is we're going to have some short presentations, and then the panelists will ask each other questions, and I will throw in some questions as well. And we're going to start with Laura to give us some background and some general understanding of Jews and the current presidential campaign. And then we're going to turn to, I guess, political insider Dan Schnur to give us to analyze it and tell us what's going on. And then we'll turn to Amnon to tell us what Israelis make of all of this. So go ahead, Laura.
Great. So I work for the Pew Research Center, where we do nationally representative polls. And in the context of the Israel-Hamas war, we've also been working with oversamples so that we can speak to the opinions of American Jews as well as American Muslims. And we did one large-scale survey with more than 12,000 Americans and a representative sample of both Jews and Muslims in February. Our goal of this survey was really to add nuance to the debate that we felt like maybe didn't allow people to have kind of more nuanced opinions of both sides. So for example, as opposed to asking people whether or not they sympathized with the Palestinians or the Israelis, a common survey question we had seen to that point, we made sure that we could give people the opportunity to say that they sympathized with both peoples. And we found that a majority of people do sympathize with both peoples. We also wanted to understand kind of the attitudes as they relate to a just war theory. So to allow people to say both which side had validity in its attack, as well as the acceptability of its conduct. So we asked people separate questions, for example, about whether or not Israel's response to Hamas's attack had been valid, as well as how acceptable the way they were conducting the response was. And again, this was asked of the American public writ large, but also of Jews and Muslims in particular. We've also been tracking attitudes towards the war. So we did another poll in September, essentially exactly concurrent with the pager attacks. It fielded essentially the day that the pager attacks went off and fielded for 1 week. And we were interested in whether or not views of the war have changed. And I'll leave you with a couple of findings from that particular survey because it's our most current one. But we wanted to understand, for example, how people view Israel's response to the war, whether or not they've gone too far, whether or not they haven't gone far enough, or their response has been about right. And we found that slightly more Americans now than earlier in the year say that Israel's response has gone too far. It's a plurality of those who give a response. But the American public is broadly unsure. Around a third of Americans don't know how they feel about Israel's response, and that share has actually increased in the past year as well. So there's not a great deal of certainty necessarily among the public at large, but there are very large partisan differences. 50% of Democrats think that Israel's response has gone too far. 13% of Republicans agree. We also have asked about whether or not Americans want the US to be involved in negotiating a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. And we see that an increasing share of Americans think that the US should be playing a major role in resolving this issue. And among Democrats, a plurality of people think that this is an important role that the US should take. Republicans, for their part, are slightly more likely to say that the US should play no role at all. So these are the kind of issues that we've been tracking over the past year. We also have found, on balance, that American Jews and American Muslims are more likely to feel very intensely about this conflict, as are young Americans. And I think we'll kind of speak to all of those trends as we go forward with this presentation.
Thank you. Yes, I think there's going to be a lot of questions. Dan, take it away. What do you make of this as a political analyst, and what should Republicans and Democrats know about this?
Well, Bruce, thank you for having me here today. And I want to thank Lisa and the entire team at the Casden Institute, not just for having us on today's program, but for the tremendous work they've done for many years on the USC campus. We're really, really grateful to them. I also have to tell you, Laura, I've been a big fan, not just of Fuse, but of your work on this topic for some time now. So it's great to have the chance to meet you, if not face-to-face, screen to screen. Mm-hmm. And I will touch a little bit on on Fuse findings, and I'll be eager to hear more about it. We usually, in these pre-election programs, whether for Casden or for any other Jewish focused platforms, we usually do pre-election platform discussions, as you know, Bruce, to talk specifically about the Jewish vote. And today's discussion, to me, it needs to be a much bigger and a much broader one, because the events of the last 12 and a half months in Israel and Gaza have made issues relating to the Middle East, and particularly to Israel, much more relevant to the broader electorate than is normally the case. Now, I think it's important for us to recognize that even given the war there, foreign policy issues in general, in Gaza in particular, still rank fairly low among most American voters. And again, Laura can speak to this with greater expertise than I can. But there's no question that the hostilities have raised the salience of the issue for a number of voters, and that does have the potential to affect the outcome in several key swing states and ultimately in the presidential election itself. As far as the Jewish vote, we've seen minor shifts since the beginning of the war in Gaza. Before last October 7th, Jews leaned heavily Democratic. Now slightly less so, but it hasn't been a huge shift, and we can talk more about that a bit later if our guests would like. But again, I do want to talk for another minute or two before giving Amnon a chance to weigh in. I'm fascinated to hear his perspective, to once again talk about the broader electorate. Now look, we know, not just from data, but from our own lives, that anti-Zionism and the even more direct and pernicious threat of anti-Semitism comes from both the political left and the political right in this country. But it's very clear, and Laura alluded to this, that the Gaza war has made the split within the Democratic Party much more visible and inarguably much more potentially impactful on the outcome of the upcoming election. And this is not meant to minimize the threat from ultra-conservatives, the blood and soil nationalists. That threat is pernicious. It has been for many years, and we're all very familiar with it. But in recent years, we've seen an increasing number of progressive Americans who become much more vocal in their criticism of Israel and sometimes of Jews. And again, Laura and her colleagues at Pew have done excellent research on this. So this is not me choosing sides as a former Republican who's been an independent for many years, but simply recognizing in as nonpartisan a way as possible that in this election, the divisions on the left are much more relevant to the outcome of the election. Jewish voters ourselves, of course, we're 2.5% of the population. And that's not a large percentage of the electorate. But all of you know how closely divided this country is. And with all 7 of the key swing states in this country, all essentially tied in most respected public opinion polls, even very small numbers of Jewish voters could be impactful, particularly in the states of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona and Nevada, but certainly in all 7 of those key swing states. And while the Jewish population in my home state of Wisconsin and the southeastern states of Georgia and North Carolina is not quite as large as in the first 4 states I mentioned, in a very, very close race, those votes make a difference. We should also talk about the large Arab American population in Michigan, roughly twice the size of the Jewish vote. We can come back to that in a few minutes later, if you like. But again, where I want to wind up is where I started. The biggest potential impact here is from the Democratic left. The numbers that Laura cited show that many, many Democrats, particularly from the more progressive wing of the party, are very, very harshly critical of the approach that the Biden administration, including Harris, have taken in this conflict over the last year plus. And to me, one of the most important questions in this entire election is whether those dissatisfied progressive voters will support Harris despite their disagreements with the Biden-Harris administration on the Middle East, whether they will cast a vote for a third-party candidate or stay home altogether, or whether, even in small numbers, some of them will cross over and vote for Donald Trump. Simply put, if they do turn out for Harris and put their disagreements over the Middle East aside, her chances of winning these swing states in the election increase dramatically. The more of them either stay home or switch sides, even if agreeing with Harris on more domestic policy, decide to switch or to stay out altogether, then Trump's chances of victory become much, much greater.
Great. Thank you, Dan. A true Dan Schnur analysis.
I think that's a compliment, but thank you.
Yeah, no, I used to always enjoy listening to you on the public affairs radio in Los Angeles. Amnon, what do Israelis make of all this goings on among American Jews?
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for inviting me. So I've been tracking American public opinion towards Israel for a long time, over 20 years now, and I've been talking for a long time about the increasing divide between Republicans and Democrats. This is something that Laura has alluded to, and I believe Dan as well. And this is something that has been a staple of today of American public opinion towards Israel. What is fascinating is how this has caught strongly by Israelis. In the last few years, I've been tracking Israeli public opinion towards the United States. So I've been starting to look at the reverse side of that. And I've been doing that since about the Obama administration, moving into the Trump administration, and ever since. And what is interesting to see is how Israelis have a very clear view of Democrats versus Republicans, as Republicans as favorable of Israel and Democrats not. A lot stronger even than their counterparts in the United States. And this is something that is, we'll talk about that a bit later as well about with the numbers, but today support for Trump is huge among Israelis. They view Trump as the candidate that is committed to Israel, that has even in terms of loves Israel compared to Kamala Harris, who does not. They view Trump as the better candidate to show support for Israel later on if needed. And maybe we'll talk maybe about the numbers later, but this is important just to understand that they view this election as extremely important, that whatever comes out of this will have a very clear effect on U.S.-Israel relations. If they are right or not, this is a different debate, but for them, something will happen on November 5th. Something will happen, and that will have large consequences to Israel. So they view this election in very carefully. Having said that, I do want to say that as somebody who is all the time concerned about the partisan divide, the same divide that we see in the United States between Republicans and Democrats, we have it very strongly in Israel. So right-leaning voters in Israel are extremely supportive of Trump. Left or center left or opposition right now are more supportive of Harris, and yet the divide is not as strong. You still see center left preferring Trump, and that is to some extent because of the nature of the debate or the nature of the coverage, news coverage of the elections in Israel that present that dichotomy between Republicans versus Democrats, Republicans supportive of Israel and Democrats not, Trump supportive of Israel and Harris not. This is something that goes into also the public views in Israel.
Wow. So I'm going to start with Laura and just, do you have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to add in relation to our other two speakers?
Yeah, Amnon, you just brought up an interesting point about Israeli views of Trump. And I just wanted to call attention to the fact that one of the things we do work on is global comparative public opinion. And so we did surveys in 2017, for example, in 25 or so countries. And in almost every country that we surveyed, views of the United States and views of the president changed pretty precipitously. We went from the Obama era into the Trump era. And in almost every country, negative views of the US shut up, people lost confidence in the US president. Israel and Hungary were the two exceptions. It was only really in those two places where people had more confidence in the US president and had more positive views of the United States. And this is definitely something we've seen, that not only is Israeli public opinion of Trump relatively positive, they ascribe incredibly positive attributes to him, but it really stands out relative to almost every other country that we survey. I also wanted to return to something that Dan said, because I think there is something interesting about the Jewish vote right now. And it's very clear that foreign policy is a top issue for many American Jews. We asked a question about which issues were very important to people's vote, and 72% of American Jews say foreign policy is very important for making their decision. But it's important to note that this is not really different from the 77% who say Supreme Court nominations, the 72% who say the economy, and the 63% who say healthcare. So foreign policy is an important factor for American Jews, and slightly more important than it is for many of the other religious groups that we can analyze. But it's really comparable to many other domestic issues. And among Americans writ large, it's important to note that typically foreign policy is not the top voting issue for people. It's certainly important, and it's notably salient among particular subgroups. So, for example, American Jews and American Muslims are much more likely to say that the Israel-Hamas war makes them feel angry, it makes them feel sad, it makes them feel exhausted. But American young people also stand out. And I think when we talk about kind of on the margins, which populations are going to really matter. The 18 to 29-year-olds are interesting. And that's actually just how we break the data. Could be the 18 to 25-year-olds. I'm just kind of speaking writ large of the youngest sample that we analyze. But back as early as last January, we wanted to ask about specific conflicts to see how they rated relative to one another in terms of how important people thought they were both to national policy and to them personally. So we asked about the Israel-Hamas war, the Russia-Ukraine war, and then tensions between China and Taiwan. And there are kind of three things that emerge from the data. One is that when it comes to national security, Americans see all of these as roughly equally important. When it comes to personal importance and national importance, older Americans say all of them are more important to national security and more important to them personally than younger Americans. But there's one particular thing that I think really stands out in the context of this conversation, which is the Israel-Hamas war was the only conflict for which a majority of 18 to 29-year-olds said it was personally important to them. The other two were only important to a minority. So this conflict in particular, relative to some others, is particularly salient for young Americans. And I think Dan was talking about how turnout in particular can be important here. It's what's going to happen among people who maybe are disenchanted with both candidates, for example. They don't necessarily think that the Democratic left has stood up on this issue the way they might want their candidate to do. I think the real issue is, are these people who find this conflict so particularly salient going to stay home, or are they going to differentiate between the candidates and vote on some other issues, perhaps like domestic issues that they might care about?
Great. Dan, what questions or comments do you have for our...
Well, I could easily take up the rest of our time just asking Amnon and Laura follow-up questions to their presentations, but
we'll do a couple rounds, though.
I'm not that greedy. A couple things I'll mention, and then I do want to pose a question to both of them. First of all, I think Laura's point about where foreign policy ranks as a voter priority is a really important one. And we do see, and Laura, correct me if your data shows differently, but what I've seen in other public opinion polling, not as reputable as Pew, of course, but we do what we can, is that it's been many years, decades in fact, since Israel has ranked as the primary voting determinant for American Jews. And domestic policy issues, particularly social and cultural issues, tend to be much higher priorities. So while the Middle East has become more important to the American Jewish community in this election, it still ranks significantly behind other issues that are more central to the domestic political discussion. And we can talk more about that in a moment, particularly as it affects my former Republican Party. As far as progressives, I mean, Laura made some good points on this also. My theory, and it's just a theory, is that Gaza has become almost a symbol of a broader dissatisfaction among Democratic progressives. They've never been particularly strong supporters of Biden. They tended to be much more likely to support either Warren or Sanders in the 2020 election. And as the party's leaders came together behind Biden, a lot of progressives reluctantly did as well, primarily because they saw him as the best way of beating Trump. And so it shouldn't be particularly surprising that if they supported a candidate without much enthusiasm, it's unlikely they'd become more excited about him as times passed. And on issues like climate, on issues like race relations, on issues like police reform, and most notably over the last several months on issues like immigration, Democratic progressives are frustrated with the Biden administration and the Harris campaign on a number of fronts. And I feel like Gaza has become almost a symbol of that broader dissatisfaction. There are certainly things that make the war there unique, but I wonder if it has created an opportunity for progressives dissatisfied with Biden and Harris on other fronts to respond more vocally and more viscerally, and perhaps we can get into that later. But here's my question for both Amnon and Laura, is I wouldn't go quite as far to say, hearing poll numbers from the US and Israel, it's not quite Mars and Venus, but certainly there's a tremendous dichotomy between American Jews and other diaspora Jews and Israelis on their feelings about American politics. And my question to both of you is, do those two groups, Israelis, Amnon, and Laura, American Jews, do they understand how different our opinions are about American politics?
So, Laura, why don't you go ahead and answer, and then we'll go to Amnon, and I have a question too. I want to throw in a little bit of a wonky question.
You're curious whether or not Americans and Israelis recognize how different our domestic politics are?
No, how they understand how, well, that too. But I guess the question I ask is for you, Laura, do American Jews understand how differently Israelis regard American politics than American Jews do? And my question then to Amnon is the opposite. Do Israelis understand how different their opinions about American politics are from American Jews?
It's an interesting question. On balance, Americans do not know a lot about foreign policy. So leaving aside the American Jews for 1 second, we did ask in February 3 knowledge questions about the Israel-Hamas war. And we asked them with multiple choice, so you could see the correct answer as well as the incorrect answer. And 62% of Americans could correctly identify that Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel. 50% could say that at that point in the conflict, deaths were higher among Palestinians than among Israelis. 80% could say that Hamas started the war. Again, these are multiple choice. And these views are incredibly consequential. People who do not answer correctly, and typically they were not answering wrong, they were just choosing the don't know response that we provided them. The people who said that they didn't know were significantly more likely to say that they didn't know about almost everything else on the survey. And when we ask other foreign policy questions, for example, we've asked over time about countries that are not members of Ukraine, members of NATO, and the correct answer was Ukraine, and things like that, there is relatively low knowledge. So turning back to the Jewish vote for a second, Jews are more likely to know the answers to all of those questions, and they knew them at very high rates relative to the general public. But typically, the average American is not particularly attuned to foreign policy news at all, let alone to understand the domestic fractures in a different country. I don't know enough about the Jewish knowledge in particular relative to the American public, but the way I would generalize about Americans is they probably do not know about Israeli domestic cleavages. And I think even the way our media presents what's happening in Israel right now, I don't think the average American necessarily knows why certain protests are taking place or kind of views the distinction of the people who want the hostages back versus don't, and the protests that are taking place. I don't think that the average American is seeing a sophisticated take on that and how the cleavages manifest. But I could be pleasantly surprised. I just do not have data to speak to that.
Great.
So
Really good question, Dan.
So a few things. First of all, to answer Dan's question, I don't. So Israelis know, I think, have a relatively good grasp of foreign policy because it relates to them. So they understand whether ammunition is coming or not, right? So weapons, to what extent this is actually happening. I am not sure that they understand exactly how Jewish voters vote in the United States. But if they do, I believe they see them as associated with the left, the liberal left, not necessarily understanding the situation in Israel, and therefore they don't really relate to them, I think. So I don't think that the fact that there is a difference between them doesn't really ring a problem to them on that regard. I agree with you, by the way, that Gaza is considered to be as a symbol within the American public opinion. I think this is something that is important. But I do want to say that Israelis, if we go back to what Laura said, that Americans don't really understand foreign policy, Israelis don't really understand American politics. And from what they see, Israel is the issue in this election. Now, and the reason that you think that is because they watch the news, and everything that is covered about the news in the United States refers to Muslims in Michigan just today in the news, right? And Trump Trump rally in Dearborn, right? So that's the kind of thing that they look at, and they understand that, okay, so it's not really about popular elections, it is about electoral college, and Michigan is important, and in Michigan, Muslims are going to vote for Trump. And why? Because of the war. So for them, this is the issue. So they don't see the big picture of elections in the United States. It could be that because the elections are close, that can have an effect, and this is kind of the debate that we have right now. But I do have a question to the panelists. For Americans that do see Israel as an issue right now in the elections, to what extent, and also not only that it is an issue, that it is something that drives specific states or specific campaigns on this issue, to what extent this will have a long-term effect on how Americans view U.S.-Israel relations. And the reason that I'm asking that is this relates to a survey that I just did with Mark Tester at the University of Michigan on American public opinion towards Israel. And one of the questions that we asked is to what extent what is happening right now is affecting the strength of the United States, what is happening right now in the Middle East, specifically with Israel versus in Gaza and Lebanon, to what extent this affects U.S. standing in the world. And Americans do see that as something that it will have an effect. Not a majority, but a significant number of Americans. So this, to what extent the fact that Israel is in the news and in the news regarding an election and may have an outcome on this election, may have an outcome that will have an effect on Democrats in the United States, how will that affect the way that they view Israel and U.S.-Israel relations? So this is one question. Maybe a second round afterwards, I will ask another question about anti-Semitism. I think somebody here mentioned that issue, but maybe I'll wait.
I did bring up anti-Semitism around, and I'm glad we'll get a chance to talk about it later. I'll take a first shot at your question, and then Laura will explain to you why I'm wrong and she's right. But I have good news and bad news for you on this front. The good news, and I think Laura can back this up, is that large majorities of American voters are still very strong in their support of Israel. While support for the Palestinians coupled with opposition to Israel has grown noticeably in recent years, this is a very vocal, albeit influential minority. So I think the overall numbers still skew fairly decisively in the directions of Israel, although, as Laura mentioned earlier, the Democratic Party in particular is increasingly divided on this issue. So that's the good news. I think you have an electorate here that's much more pro-Israel than not. The downside, I'm very eager to hear Laura and Pugh's findings on this, gets to generational shift. And there's no question that not just within the Jewish community, but more broadly among American voters, support for Israel is much lower among millennials and Gen Z than among their parents and grandparents. So if you had asked the question in the short term, I could have given you a very positive answer. But because you're farsighted enough to ask about the long term also, I think the challenge going forward is going to become more daunting. And Bruce, I know this is something you've thought a lot about over the years. To me, what I try to explain to Jews and other Americans of my generation is that they say that age is a foreign country. I said, my experience, one of my formative experiences with Israel were 1967 and 1973. My parents were 1948. But for even the most passionate pro-Israel student in my class today, the context in which they learned about Israel in the Middle East is much, much different than me and my generation did. And that creates a much more formidable challenge in the long run.
Great. Laura, go ahead.
I think it really depends what you mean by support for Israel, because we've asked favorability of the Israeli people, favorability of the Israeli government, and confidence in Netanyahu. In terms of the Israeli people, there's a broad positive view. Around 2/3 of Americans have a favorable view of the Israeli people. But what Dan just said about age is incredibly consequential, because views among the youngest Americans of the Israeli people have fallen 17 percentage points since 2019. Views of the people are getting worse, and among the 18 to 29-year-olds, many more have favorable views of the Palestinian people than the Israeli people. Then if you want to look just generally to the Israeli government, among the American public overall, more people have an unfavorable view of the Israeli government than a favorable view. And it's even more negative when it comes to Netanyahu. And views of Netanyahu fell somewhat dramatically between our spring 2023 and our spring 2024 poll. Most of those people were actually kind of people who said they didn't really know who he was, changing to be unfavorable. We didn't see a major drop off in terms of the kind of confidence number that we had previously. But I'm not sure I would fully agree that more Americans have a kind of positive wealth of support for Israel than the opposite. I think, in fact, if you ask about either Israel or the Israeli government, which is, I would argue, more important when we're thinking about supporting them politically than necessarily views of the people, which every country we've ever asked about, people have more positive views of the people than the government, like the Chinese people than the Chinese government, Russian people, Russian government. But at this point, Americans are quite divided. They're divided along age lines, along party lines, both, and more kind of have a negative view of Israel than not. When we asked an open-ended question also before October 7th about which country represents America's top ally, Israel is not a top response. In fairness, Americans have trouble with that question in general. The top response is the UK at about 22%, and it's an open-ended question, and plenty just say the US has no allies, but only around 4% name Israel. It is higher among Republicans. What Americans want when it comes to Israeli policy is also quite divided, and so it'll be interesting in the context of this election to see how either winning candidate seizes upon that. Republicans are much more supportive, for example, of providing arms to Israel. Democrats are broadly not in support of that. Democrats are much more supportive of providing aid to Gaza. Republicans are quite divided on that. So there are kind of clear divisions when it comes to policy attitudes on some specific issues, but there are also divisions just in terms of views of the country and views of the government.
Laura, I have a little bit of a technical question, and this also for Dan. In polling, I assume you identify Jews as people who answer the religion question. And of course, the incredibly excellent, much used Pew 2020 Portrait of Jewish Americans has a second category of Jews of no religion, who I assume are not included in your other analysis of the Jewish vote. And I was wondering if you have a sense of, well, first of all, I'm sure you're not going to spend the money to add that small little category with 5 additional questions. But do you have a sense of how it might impact your conclusions about how Jews are voting and so forth?
That's a really good question. You are correct that in all of the data that I've just mentioned to you that we've collected this year in terms of Jewish views, we are going for the simple approach that's still quite expensive to oversample Jews on the basis of whether or not they answered their religion. And part of that is logistical. To do the oversample that we did in February, which captured many hundreds of Jews beyond what we maintain on our own American Trends panel, we turned to other nationally representative probability-based panels where people don't necessarily have the questions we would need to capture Jews by no religion, and we were depending on their categorization of people. In terms of what we would find if we had Jews of no religion skew somewhat more Democratic. They may also skew by age. I would have to check that. That is not a survey I'm probably even as familiar with as you are, just because I work on foreign policy more. But they definitely skew more Democratic. And so I would say that if we factored them in, we would probably find even more Jews who would be critical of Israel, more supportive of Harris.
And you hear a lot about, certainly in certain Jewish policy circles and commentators about, left-wing professors are educating younger Americans to be anti-Israel and even anti-American and so forth. I was wondering, among those 18 to 29-year-olds, if you've had a chance or if you have a large enough subsample to look at the impact of education on views toward Israel.
That is a great question that I do not believe we have looked into in detail. We were looking to disaggregate briefly among 18 to 29-year-olds by party by education, and we didn't have enough. But I'm not sure if we've looked just among age and education. So I can check that for you, but I don't know it offhand.
Yeah, I'd be very curious.
Yeah.
Okay, since we've all been peppering you, you get to, on round two, get to ask other questions of people.
Sure.
Bruce, if I can add a couple of thoughts.
Dan, go ahead. Yes.
To Laura's analysis. One, the question of religious Jews versus cultural Jews is a broader one than we have time to fully explore today. But what I would tell you is I have seen survey work, not just in the Jewish community, but in the broader electorate, that religiosity, not the faith that you practice, Jewish, Christian, or otherwise, but rather the intensity with which you practice your preferred faith, has become one of the driving determinants in American politics. For most of the history of the two-party system, from the 1860s on, economic issues were the most reliable indicator of whether you would vote Republican or Democrat. In 2004, for the first time, we saw religiosity defined as the frequency with which an individual attends religious services as the greatest determinant between whether someone would vote Democrat or Republican. And that difference has intensified over the years, not only among the voters of various Christian faiths, but within the Jewish community as well. Second, very quickly, if Laura is able to identify some education-related numbers, I'd be eager to hear them. But I'll offer you just a supposition based on other polling data that we do see. We know that voters, we know that I'll hold off on this in case Laura does have any information, but there are other social and cultural factors that do influence voters' attitudes towards Israel, which might help flesh out your follow-up question.
It's going to take me longer to run things than the length of this because it's not in the banners that we have pre-run, but we can follow up. We can post it on the website if you want.
Perfect.
I have the two Pew Jewish Studies open at any given moment on my computer.
I'll put that down for our
I only
team.
have two to work with. Amnon, just sort of following up on what we've been hearing from Laura and from Dan, does it sound like Israel and American Jews are sort of going their separate ways and creating sort of separate communities that don't relate to each other as much?
Whoa. Just a second. Before I'm answering this, I want to relate a bit to the other issues that were raised, and I will answer this. First of all, I agree with Laura. I think the decline in public opinion towards Israel is evident. It is stronger than what Dan, I think, is referring to. That's also from the things that and I think generational differences are big. Not only that, also it trumps a bit the partisan divide. You see a decline in support for Israel even among young Republicans. So this is something that will have a strong effect moving forward as the massive group of baby boomers and around that generations are moving out, will find weaker support for Israel. Adding to that, we also ask questions, and I think this is something that we should take in mind, that Israel has been going before the war and after the war through processes of change. And I'm referring specifically to the constitutional revolution, constitutional coup, constitutional reform that has been happening in Israel. And we've asked in surveys in the United States, then we asked Americans, if Israel changes or does something that is against the values of Americans, will that lead you to reevaluate the relationship between Israel and the United States, or United States and Israel? And we find that they do. Now, this is stronger among Democrats compared to Republicans, because there is a set of support for Israel among Republicans that is beyond what Israel does. But this is something to pay attention to, because first of all, this is still happening. Israel is in a process of reforms that may have an effect on how democratic it is, but also in its actions. If Israel acts in a way that Americans don't feel comfortable with, either in Gaza or in Lebanon or in other places, will that have an effect on the way that they view that alignment, or that Israel is an ally? And I think that from public opinion, we see that it does. So this is something that may have an effect moving forward. So that is something to pay attention to, I think. Going to your question, well, I think to some extent, American Jews and Israeli Jews have never been aligned too well. It is true now, it is true in the past. There is an interest in Israel, but they had different views of what America should do for Israel. And also there is a partisan divide within Israeli Jews. We don't see that strength of partisan divide among American Jews. So this is something that in terms of public opinion, they're not in tandem, and I don't think they've ever been, and definitely they're not now.
Can I double back to one thing Dan said about religiosity? I think your general point about the kind of the strength of people's religion and their praying is such a salient cleavage. That's absolutely borne out in our data. And we can also see it when it comes to religious groups, because, for example, the group that has the most confidence in Netanyahu to do the right thing regarding world affairs is kind of white evangelical Protestants, significantly more confident than Jews. I think it's 57% of white evangelicals have positive views of Netanyahu, 42% of Jews. And Jews are quite a bit higher than some of the other groups, as well as kind of the non-affiliated. So you're definitely correct that some of these more like religious strongholds in the United States stand out for their commitment to Israel and to the Israeli government. And it's especially evident in the evangelical numbers.
Dan and Laura, do you think this could explain in part the age differences, in that we know from the Pew, really, I'll put in a plug for the Pew Religious Landscape Survey 2007, 2014, and I understand another one's coming up, that younger people, that the people who identify with no religion is something like 30-40% of younger Americans. And I'm wondering the extent to which religiosity is one of the explanatory factors about the decline of support for Israel by age.
I think there certainly could be some of that, but I think Dan spoke about this earlier, about the formative nature of your experience learning about Israel, and kind of most younger voters have come of age in an era where Israel has been relatively strong and has not necessarily been seen as the victim in any of the wars in the same way that maybe it was in the past. And I think everything we know from the political socialization literature suggests that that could be very consequential for how people form their views. There are also education divides and party divides among younger Americans, and racial divides, right? We have a very multicultural kind of Gen Z coming up. And we do see that some of these attitudes are different among people of different races, whether that's because of religiosity, because of party. We can't really disentangle that with our type of data, but all of these things certainly could be at play.
Yeah, I agree with Laura, Bruce. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's primarily experiential, but I think you make a really important point that the growing secularization of the American electorate among young people is going to change the political landscape in all sorts of ways. And the fact that younger Americans are less likely to identify with a religion than previous generations is going to change the playing field on many issues, Israel certainly among them.
I just want to tell our audience.
but we
Oh,
also
we can put a question in the Q&A and we'll come to those. Go ahead, Amnon.
I just want to say that we also see a decline in support for Israel among young Americans, even among young different Christian groups, including evangelicals. So this is beyond even secularization. This is about, and I think this is the exposure that they have right now is of Israel, a powerful state that sometimes does things that are not necessarily good, or at least that's the way they're presented for them in the news. And then they're critical of that. And from what we know about the effect of cohort maturation, as they move forward, they are not necessarily going to be more supportive of Israel down the road. And that may have a strong effect.
Young Republicans are also standing out in interesting ways in our data writ large. They tend to be less likely to say that it's important for the US to be the strongest military in the world. They're less likely to want to provide weapons to Israel, but they're also less supportive of Ukraine, of basically overseas commitments of the United States. So we're seeing kind of a change among young Republicans relative to old Republicans on a number of kind of activist foreign policy type measures.
You have a sense, Laura, and also Dan, and I guess everybody, Amnon, where Jewish Republicans fit in the Republican Party, even though Jewish Republicans are a minority of American Jews. I was wondering, do they fit in with the MAGA group? Are they Nikki Haley Republicans? And just as an example, I went back to the Pew 2020 study of Jews, and I found that I think 68% of Jewish Republicans in 2020 strongly approved of the job that Trump was doing. 72% thought he was doing good on Israel, but only 68% gave him an overall approval rating. It sounds to me like that, from what I just remember from the press, that's lower than overall Republican approval of Trump even in 2020.
Yeah, so in 2020, it looks like through most of that year, in terms of favorability of Trump or approval of his job handling, Republicans on balance, about 8 in 10 or more would approve of him. So among Jewish Republicans, this seems to be slightly lower. Whether or not that's common is a little bit difficult for me to assess, because the Jewish survey, as you know, perhaps better even than I do, has been kind of at two major points in time, but it's something we hope to be able to track going forward a little bit more. Previously, we did not have enough Jews on our proprietary American Trends panel to look at them regularly. And now, thanks to this religious landscape study that you just mentioned, we've been able to recruit a number. So hopefully we'll be able to measure the Jewish vote kind of going forward more regularly. But yeah, on balance, I would say Republican Jews are probably somewhat less complimentary of Trump than Republicans overall. But 68% is nothing to scoff at. A lot of politicians would love that approval rating.
And to the extent that it includes the Israeli Americans, that certainly, that's from what Amnon says, would be part of that. Dan, I've been just dying to ask you this question, so I'm going to throw it out. I'm sure many other people are probably curious. Given Pennsylvania, and apparently one of the reasons for not choosing Josh Shapiro as the vice presidential running mate was kind of progressive objections to his very pro-Israel stances. And I think maybe some other, more conservative stances he's taken as governor, but certainly his pro-Israel stance. As an advisor to many campaigns, if someone were to call you now, and say, did we make a mistake? What would you tell them?
I would say, ask me the question again the day after Pennsylvania is called for one candidate or the other.
Uh-huh.
It was fairly evident then, but it's even more clear now how much the outcome of this election relies on the state of Pennsylvania. Both the Harris and Trump campaign have spent more money there in ads than in the top two other swing states combined. Both candidates have spent more time in Pennsylvania themselves than in any other swing state, and by some margin. And when you have a governor with a 60% plus approval rating, as Laura would tell you, that generally tends to be a political asset. I would note this, that Governor Shapiro, while a very strong supporter of Israel, his position on the war is not noticeably different from that of Governor Walz or Senator Kelly or Vice President Harris. He is the only Jewish individual among them. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that the vice president or anyone around her is anti-Semitic. However, I would note, going back to where we began this conversation about the anti-Semitism on the extremes of both parties, that the objections to Shapiro were much louder and much more insistent than those toward other Zionist and pro-Israel candidates. If Harris, jokes aside, does not win Pennsylvania and it costs her the presidency, I think you could argue that her decision to listen to those voices from her party's far left will have played a contributing role in that. If she does win Pennsylvania without him, or wins the election without Pennsylvania, then motivating her party's base will have proven to be a smarter move. But make no mistake about it, in my eyes at least, this was a very calculated political decision. At that point, remember in early August, just a few weeks after she'd become a candidate, that motivating the base to turn out on her behalf, exciting Democrats in a way that Biden had not been able to, was a greater priority.
So let's maybe turn to anti-Semitism. That's like one of the few questions we've had so far in the Q&A. I think people are just mesmerized by your brilliance and insight and thinking about all the new perspectives. Laura, I want to ask you, are you picking up anything on anti-Semitism, or is that something you're asking about in Pew surveys now? I'll note that even 10 years ago, much of the discourse in the American Jewish community, including my own field of sociology of American Jewry, was that this was becoming a non-issue. So I was wondering if you're picking that up.
So yeah, we can answer this in two ways. We can answer American views of anti-Semitism, essentially, which we did not measure as anti-Semitism. We asked about discrimination and the discrimination faced by multiple groups. And we asked about evangelical Christians, Muslims, and Jews, and the amount of discrimination that they face in American society today. And 40% now say that Jews face a lot of discrimination in the US, up from 20% only a couple of years ago. That doubling is really consequential because we have seen very limited movement in views of most of the other groups that we asked about. Essentially no change when it comes to evangelical Christians. And if anything, views of the discrimination faced by American Muslims is down from kind of the very high mark that we saw when Trump was talking about the border wall and the Muslim ban and things of that sort. Though it is up 5 percentage points since 2021. But the share of people who say that American Jews and American Muslims are facing discrimination in society today is somewhat similar. That's never been the case before in our polling. So there is a sense that American Jews are facing more discrimination than they used to. We also asked Jews how much discrimination American Jews are facing, and 92% say that they're facing a lot. So Jews are feeling that there is a lot of discrimination. We also wanted to understand kind of the personal impact of the Israel-Hamas war. So we asked people whether or not they've seen something on the media that made them feel personally offended, traditional media or social, as well as whether or not someone has said something around them that's made them feel discriminated against or that's made them uncomfortable. And we also asked whether or not people have cut off ties with someone, whether or not that's online or in person because of something they've said about the war. And large shares of American Jews have felt offended by something they've seen. Around a quarter of young people, but up to 40-ish% of Jews have cut off ties. So it's definitely something that people are feeling really palpably in their own lives.
if I may
Dan
add to
and
this.
Amnon, as both as keen observers of the American political scene, could you weigh in on that? And also, do you think there'll be any kind of backlash against Jews? Was the question after the election. Remember, Trump said, "If I lose, it'll be the Jews' fault," and I suppose other people would say if Kamala Harris loses, it'll be because of all the Jews defecting to Trump. So, do you think there'll be a Jewish question post-election, Dan and Amnon? And Laura, if you want to weigh in as well, I know that you tend to stick very close to the data.
If I may add to the anti-Semitism, this is something that we examined in a survey, in the survey that I mentioned with Mark Tessler at Michigan. We asked a battery of questions relating to anti-Semitic views and created an index of anti-Semitic views and also an index of Islamophobic views. And we see weak negative correlation between anti-Semitism and support for Israel, meaning that that there is some relationship between anti-Semitic views and support for Israel, or dissupport from Israel. And we see a weak correlation between Islamophobic views and support for Israel. So in a way, this may be playing in the background, the support for Israel. And this is something that we've been talking about for a while now, right? So to what extent the nature of the critique of Israel is beyond just a critique of what Israel is doing, but it sets on something that is more deeply rooted. This connects to the question, what will be the effect of this election on views of Jews? I don't have the data to answer this. I believe that the other two panelists may be better positioned to answer those. So I'm letting them answer this not easy question.
I'm going to greatly disappoint you then. Bruce, as I think you and I may have spoken about before, I gave up making political predictions forever in November of 2016. So I can't say that I know what the reaction will be to a defeat on either side. So, but if you take this as pure guesswork, going back to something I mentioned earlier, we've seen not just a rise in anti-Semitism on the ideological extremes in both directions, both the ultra-left and the ultra-right. I think we've also seen in recent years, given how polarized our country's become more broadly, how easy it is to tap into, how much easier it is to tap into those resentments than ever before. I'm not, when it comes to technology, I'm not a druid. I think the benefits of digital media and social media far outweigh the downsides. But 25 years ago, one lone anti-Semite in a small town was a very lonely person. Today, they can find sustenance online from thousands, if not millions, of people who share their opinion. And so whenever this election is called, however it's called, the losing side will look for scapegoats. And we know that there are a certain number of voters on the far fringes of both parties who will look for an excuse to blame the Jewish community. I can't predict how widespread that sentiment will be, but I think it would be foolish to ignore it. And so I think it's a really smart question.
I have some more questions. I don't see any more on the Q&A. So anything you guys want to ask each other or react to, because I don't want to hog this, although it's so fascinating, it's hard not to. So anything you want to follow up on?
I think keep leading us, Bruce.
Okay. So Amnon, I want to ask you just a sort of a question about the Israeli scene in general. I follow Israeli news. I teach a course on Israel at USC. I heard once somebody say the best way to understand Israeli politics and feelings about everything that's going on is to understand that certainly the Likud coalition, or the right-leaning parties in Israel with a very heavy Mizrahi constituency, I think, is, or this person put it, it's MAGA meets Black Lives Matter, if you want to understand how Israelis feel. I was wondering, does that ring true to you, or is that sort of a good way to explain Israeli politics to Americans?
Well, I think definitely Mizrahi issue is a big determinant of Israeli politics. I think right now is to understand Israeli politics is to understand the strength of the coalition that exists today. That is a coalition not only in terms of politics is a strong coalition, it is a coalition of interest that are intertwined so strongly. And that is the ultra-Orthodox and the Christian and the religious Zionists. And bear in mind, out of this, the current coalition, half is ultra-Orthodox and religious Zionists. And this is what drives Netanyahu. This is what drives his actions. And they are very demanding, and they hold the key to his coalition. And Netanyahu will do everything to maintain power for various reasons. And I think this explains the attempts to reform the Supreme Court or courts. This explains the way that they are acting now through the war, and also this explains the irresponsible decision not to draft the ultra-Orthodox or the yeshiva kids. This is something that is so powerful that would lead Netanyahu to hold his coalition for 4 years. And despite the strongest rallies that we've seen in Israel, despite the not only their strength but the scope of their attempts to influence government, nothing's happening. We have no opposition. We have no opposition in the Knesset. We have no opposition trying to lead the country on a different path. This is what we have, and we're not able to change it. And this is because of a intertwined interest that we have now. Likud, overwhelmingly Mizrahi. This is true, but also maybe to understand the Likud, also Netanyahu has been in power very long and has changed the Likud to his need, very much like the Republican Party and Trump. So I think this strongly explains the way that we have in Israel.
Bruce, can I ask a follow-up question?
Absolutely.
I'll apologize in advance for my ignorance, but here's my question for you. Netanyahu, whether an individual happens to be a supporter or an opponent of his, I think it's general agreement at how savvy he is politically.
Yep.
And it seems to me that there have been times in recent months when he's taken positions at the behest of his most conservative allies that he might not have taken if he wasn't so reliant on them for his majority. If that's the case, and if it's not, then correct me, then I would ask, why is it that the more traditional Likud, here in this country, we have a phrase we use for more traditional Republicans, we call them Rockefeller Republicans. So maybe I'll refer to Sharon Likudniks. Why is it that the Lapids, the Bennetts, the Gantzes of the world haven't been willing to set aside Netanyahu's legal challenges in order to create a government that they believe will handle the country's existential challenges more effectively than a government that is beholden to its most conservative members? Does that make sense?
Oh, definitely. Okay, so a few things. First of all, the Likud has no Rockefeller Republicans at this point. That is a sad. There are strong attempts to try to influence what were viewed as moderate right or moderate Likud to go against Netanyahu. That did not succeed. What you're asking is why they're not entering a coalition with Netanyahu, to try to end the escalation of what we have right now. First of all, it did happen with Gideon Saar. He did join. He's probably the only Rockefeller Republican or Rockefeller Likud, and he joined now the Likud. He's now actually strengthening Netanyahu. But other than that, who can join him? And it goes back to the coalition of interest. It's not really about only Netanyahu whether he will go to jail or not. Lapid entering or the Gantz entering, they need to make decisions about building in the territories. That's what the Zionists, the religious Zionists want, including building new settlements in Gaza. They need to agree to not draft the ultra-Orthodox kids. Those are things that they cannot make any compromise on. Even if they agree that Netanyahu will just, continue to be the prime minister. Not only that, nobody trusts him on the other side. So it's just impossible for them to join. The only one who did is Gideon Saar. Well, probably has nothing else to lose at this point. But that's the strength of his coalition. It is a coalition of interest that he holds very strongly. But I do want to say one more thing. I am not sure exactly what Netanyahu would have done without them. We all the time think that Netanyahu is a different person, but he's just all the time doing something in order to make his coalition strong. But we have a history of Netanyahu not doing what we expected him to do as a person. So maybe he doesn't want to do them. Maybe he believes that right now the situation is good for Israel. I can't understand that, but that's maybe what he believes. And this is something that we need to reconcile with the fact that this is who Netanyahu is. Even if there is a vision of Netanyahu, somebody who is more moderate, probably is not.
That is fascinating. Thank you very much. But if it helps at all, I will point out that we don't have Rockefeller Republicans in this country anymore either. So.
I agree.
But we do have the cross the aisle Liz Cheney's campaigning periodically, right? But I was just going to offer one comparative data point, which is, again, we do this cross-national survey. And so one of the places that is consistently the most ideologically divided in the world on almost any issue is, perhaps unsurprisingly, the United States. But one of the others that tends to be top or second most in terms of the division we see between the left and the right is Israel. It's the gap in attitudes on so many questions between the Israeli left and the Israeli right is usually second only to the United States. It's very, very kind of pervasive.
And I will add to that it's not only that it's not only the gap between left and right, but also effective polarization is we are very close to you, if not leading you, Americans.
For sure. And this, with like satisfaction with democracy, the gap between those who have their person in power and those who don't, which is usually how we analyze it in Israel, is it's a chasm. And the same is true in the US.
Agree.
Laura, I wanted to ask you, if we have time, about, I think I was somewhere I read, maybe it was in Pew, that both Republicans and Democrats are now minority parties, in that they, the number of people who identify with either party is smaller than the number who identify as independent or no preference and so forth. I was wondering if you have some thoughts, or I would not say some thoughts, some data on, who these non-aligned people are, and are they simply people don't care, or are they people who are really kind of alienated from both parties, and what impact that might have?
Great question. So yes, the share of independents in the United States keeps growing. But I think our politics team would tell you that what it means to be an independent in the United States is maybe not the same as what it means in some other countries, because almost everyone in the United States leans one direction or another. And it's not just that they will answer the question when you ask them which way they lean, it's that they very consistently take mostly Republican positions or mostly Democratic positions when they lean. So while they tend to feel maybe less intensely about certain issues, maybe they have somewhat favorable views of their candidate as opposed to very favorable or things like that, essentially leaners largely mimic partisans, full partisans. And so the true independence in the US remains incredibly small. We have many decades of data showing that. But your second question, which is like, why would you say you're independent then? Why won't you commit to a party? Kind of speaks to something else that we've been seeing, which is the growth of the kind of dual haters. So we can measure that in two ways: the people who dislike both parties and the people who dislike both candidates. And at the time when it was a Biden and Trump election, the share of dual haters of the candidates was at a historic high in our many decades of polling. But the share who dislike both parties is incredibly high as well. It's also near the top of kind of our history of measuring it. And so the idea of what you are if you say you're an independent, even if you lean, you're a disaffected person who tends to be less satisfied with politics these days, less trusting of the institutions, much less trusting of the political parties. And so it is important that more people are saying that. But how do they actually, they're not like a swing voter in the traditional sense that we talk about it in elections necessarily.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Bruce, I know we're about to wrap up, but if I can just add to that very briefly, I think both of Laura's points are really important, but the last one in particular, while I prefer not to look at data other than Pew's, occasionally I'm forced to. And over the years, there's actually considerable research on her findings on independence. And I'll just put it a little bit more starkly than someone who's encumbered by data has to. There's very little to distinguish someone who calls themselves an independent from a traditional Democrat or Republican on a left-right spectrum. As she said, almost all independents are just as liberal as most Democrats and just as conservative as most Republicans. What separates them is not a left-right perspective, but what I would call an up-down, or rather an outside-in perspective. And it's animosity, not just a dissatisfaction of the two parties, but an animosity toward politics and government as a whole. If you look at independence in our political history, in our country's political history, Ross Perot, Jesse Ventura, Teddy Roosevelt, I would actually argue that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are really independents much more than they're either Republican or Democrat. Think of them as practitioners of middle finger politics. People whose ideology left-right doesn't make them independent, but their anger and their hostility toward politics as a whole. And I think right now in American politics, those resentful voters tend to be very isolationist and tend to be protectionist and tend to be much more wary of entanglements, whether it be in Ukraine or Taiwan or in the Middle East.
Wow. Okay, so we have just a few minutes. Any bottom line takeaways, either that you want to say or something you picked up from one of our other panelists, that you'd like listeners to remember from this really fascinating panel? Dan, you already gave us one, sort of a scary one to think about, but what for you are takeaways? What did you learn from Laura and from Amnon that you might bring to one of your USC classes? Or
what I learned more than anything, and it's only because I spend more time on US than Israeli politics, was I thought that Amnon's overview of the Israeli political landscape was absolutely fascinating. I pride myself on trying to keep up on Israeli domestic politics, but I found that to be extraordinarily educational. And I'm going to ask us to have a 12-hour follow-up so I can ask you more questions. But I think also equally interesting, equally important, is Laura's overview of the American electorate and the ideological challenge for Friends of Israel in this country. The demographic challenge, I think, paints not a disturbing picture, but I think should brace us for the challenges we have ahead of us as a community. And it's something I know we all feel, but hearing numbers behind it, I think, increases the urgency of our challenge and our need to come together as a community to take on that challenge.
Great. Laura, anything new questions you might put in a Pew survey, or new angles of analysis that you might
I'm so interested to see what happens in this election. And by this election, I guess I mean November 5th, all the way through what happens in the coming months. Because I think your questions about what will this mean for Jews that all of you spoke to and raised, will they be blamed? How will Jews process both their own role, and how will other people process the Jewish vote, as well as the Muslim vote? We spent less time on that, but I think the state of Michigan has been getting an outsized amount of attention for what does it mean if people in Dearborn don't turn out for Democrats, and how might this change alignment? And one thing I didn't mention is that when we last were able to look at kind of Muslim views of the election, Harris was not in the race, but we found that favorability of Biden and Trump was tied among Muslims back in February at only around a third favorable of either. So what we see come out of this election and how it matters for incredibly consequential, albeit small, groups in this country is something we'll definitely be watching.
Great, thank you. Amnon, Acharon Chaviv, we will hear from our Israeli cousins.
So maybe I'll just drop a data point and then relate. More than 75% of Israelis believe that Israel cannot defend itself independently, which means there is a divide between right and left. Definitely it is stronger among the left, but 75%, that's huge, right? So, and the only real support that we have is from the United States. And the fact that this election on November 5th is viewed by Israelis as so important for that, makes you think about what will be the consequences of the elections, regardless of who wins. And this, you asked about what it is. Will we have a Jewish problem? I think we'll have an Israel problem. After November 5th, moving forward, we'll have an Israel problem. Israel has been so much on the campaign that it cannot be good for U.S.-Israel relations. What will each one of those candidates turn into president do with it? I think time will tell, but also what would Americans do with it? And I think there's a lot to wait and see to see how that has an effect.
Well, that is a great way, not the happiest, but I think a great way to end in terms of like the importance of this election for both American Jews and Israelis. So Lisa, I'm going to turn it back to you to close us out.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Bruce, Amnon, Laura, and Dan, for such an impactful discussion today on the myriad of ways in which the Gaza war will influence the upcoming U.S. elections, and for sharing your wisdom and unique perspectives with all of us today. I would also like to thank Yoav Fromer, founding director of the Center for the Study of the United States at Tel Aviv University, for partnering with the USC Casden Institute on today's most important and timely event. To our audience, thank you all for joining us today, and I hope to see you at our next Casden event, which will be the 2024 Jerome Niemer Lecture that will take place in person on Sunday, November 17th in Town and Gown at USC, and will feature award-winning culinary historian Michael Twitty, who will be lecturing on the topic of fusion mosaic braid, decoding and deciphering Black Jewish history, identity, and material culture. Please visit the USC Casden Institute website and join our mailing list for further information. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a wonderful day.